On the pasuk v'shav sa'aretz Shabbos la'Hashem, that on the seventh year the land needs to rest. We're not allowed to do any work in the fields, in the vineyards, etc. The concept of Shemitah. In connection to this, the Zohar brings a pasuk that it says, Ki sikne v'divri, when you buy a Jewish slave, he works for 6 years, on the seventh year he goes out free. And the Zohar says that every single Yid has pleasure, has rest on the year of Shemitah. So in this time when the earth is resting, so the slaves should also get their rest, and therefore the slaves go out on the seventh year. Now what it sounds like is that the Zohar is saying that when it says Uvashvius on the seventh year the slave goes out free, it sounds like he's going out on Shemitah. But the question is, and this is a famous question, that we know all over Chazal, that the seventh year of a slave is not the seventh year which is Shemitah, but it's the seventh year from when he was sold. So how do we understand this? In order to explain this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to have a look. Generally, we know regarding mitzvahs, we know that a mitzvah can be done in a way of lichatchila, in its best possible way, and then there's sometimes something called b'diavad. You still yoytze even though it wasn't done with its greatest perfection. In Acharoinim it's explained that this is true even in matters of de'oraisa, even in matters of the Torah, and furthermore, not only in certain little details which seem to be only side points, but even very important, seemingly very important parts of the mitzvah, very much part of the mitzvah, and yet in certain cases, if you didn't do it, you were still yoytze. It says regarding to korbanos, for example, that the only time it really matters if you didn't do it is if it's something that the Torah repeated twice. Then we know you must do it. If the Torah didn't repeat it, then that detail is something that you would still be yoytze the mitzvah without. And the Rebbe says, based on this idea that you could do a mitzvah in its most perfect way, or sometimes there isn't the most perfect way, but it's still the mitzvah, quite a number of surprising things could be explained. Some of them we'll give examples over here. So by the mitzvah of Sfira Soimer, the Rebbe starts off with, now in the days of Sfira, the pasuk says, "Usfartem lechem imocharas haShabbos," you should count the day following Shabbos. Now simply it sounds like it's referring to the day of Shabbos, so you start counting on a Sunday or Motzei Shabbos. Torah Sheba'al Peh comes along and tells us that no, it means the day after Yom Tov. Shabbos over here means Yom Tov. You always start counting the day after Pesach. After the first day of Pesach, we start on the second night of Pesach. So the question then is, why is Torah saying Mimocharas HaShabbos? If it's really, it should have said Mimocharas HaYom Tov. In fact, we know that the Tzdukim, the Baisusim, made a mistake about this and thought you always start counting on a Motzei Shabbos. Based on what we said before, we'll be able to explain it. The Rebbe is about to explain that this idea of lechatchila b'diavad is not only as far as how the person fulfills the mitzvah. Sometimes he missed certain details, but even as far as the mitzvah itself is concerned, certain mitzvahs were given in a way that sometimes we could do it in the most perfect way, and sometimes the way the mitzvah was given is that we can't do it completely, but it's still the mitzvah. And the Rebbe is going to explain Sfiras HaOmer based on that, but first, to explain this idea, the Rebbe says a very simple example. Look at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And the idea of Yom Tov. Yom Tov, the proper way of doing Yom Tov in the time of the Beis HaMikdash was with bringing karbonis and aliyah l'regel. Nevertheless, we understand that even at the times when we can't be oil regel and we cannot bring the karbonis, we still have the full dinim of Yom Tov, the kedusha of Yom Tov min ha-Torah. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, let's look at the example of Yom Tov itself versus Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed is on the one hand very, very much part of Yom Tov, and you have to have Simchas Yom Tov and so on and so forth, min ha-Torah. And yet, obviously, it doesn't have the same strength or the same shleimus as the regular full days of Yom Tov. So we see, even within Torah, we see certain ideas that you have something in its most perfect way, and some things that you have the mitzvah, but even though it's seemingly missing certain parts. So the Rebbe is going to apply this now to Sfiras HaOmer. The fact that the Torah says, Mimocharas HaShabbos, is telling us that when we are actually going to start counting Sfira on Mimocharas HaShabbos in the simple literal sense, on a Motzei Shabbos, it's actually going to be a more perfect Sfiras HaOmer, as we're soon going to see. In other words, the mitzvah of Sfira was given in two ways. There is the way we do it most years, when Shavuos is not, when Pesach is not Shabbos, and therefore we're going to start counting a different way. But the mitzvah is going to be more perfect, more tamimos, is going to be more complete weeks. And the Sfira is going to be more complete when we do start counting on a Motzei Shabbos if Pesach fell out on Shabbos. So when the Torah says Mimocharas HaShabbos, it's because that's the most perfect way of doing the mitzvah. How do we understand this? So in order to understand this, the Rebbe first looks at something which seems to be a surprising medrash, based on this idea we were just speaking about. The medrash says on the word Sheva Shabbosos Tamimos Teyena, and says, when is it 7 complete weeks? The medrash gives a certain siman, but the idea being is, when Pesach falls out on Shabbos, then we're going to start counting on Motzei Shabbos, and that's when it's really 7 complete weeks. And the question is, Complete weeks, we have that every single year. We must have 7 complete weeks of Sphira. That's why if you forgot to count one night, you can't continue counting because you don't have 7 complete weeks anymore. And other halachas. Why is the Medrash saying that Tamima is complete is only when Pesach falls on Shabbos? And isn't this giving some room to the opinion of the Tzedukim of the Baisusim? But the Rebbe explains, no, the Pshat is like this. What we're saying is, of course, we have Tamimo's completion every single year. But when it falls out on Shabbos, and you start counting on Motzei Shabbos, these 7 weeks are considered more complete. You're starting every week on a Sunday, going till Shabbos, that's the weeks of Sphira, so it's considered a greater Tamimus. But of course, you still do the mitzvah even without that. The Rebbe says, this will explain also another aspect related to Sphira Soimer. When we look at Shavuos, the Chazal say, in the times when they based Rosh Chodesh on the Yom Tovim at the sighting of the moon, Shavuos could fall out sometimes on the 5th of Sivan, sometimes on the 6th of Sivan, sometimes on the 7th of Sivan. That means it's not necessarily always going to be on the day of Matan Torah. Yet, on the other hand, we know Chazal very, very much connect the idea of Shavuos with Matan Torah. In fact, Chazal say that because the Yidden accepted the Torah on this day, the day of Shavuos. This is why in the Karbonos, when it speaks about the Karban that's brought the Karban Musaf, it doesn't mention the Chatos, anything to do with sin, because Hashem is forgiving the Yidden because they accepted the Torah. And yet here we're saying Shavuos is not necessarily even on the day of Matan Torah. So the Rebbe explains the same idea. On the one hand, of course, we count Sfiras Oimer, we're looking forward, the whole idea is to get to Matan Torah. It's not always going to be the day of Matan Torah practically these days. When it falls out on the day of Matan Torah, then the idea of the 50th day in Shavuos is then going to be in a more perfect way when these two things coincide as well, that it's both the 50th day of Sfiras Oimer as well as the day of Kabbalah Satorah. The Rebbe gives some more examples for this idea. The Rebbe now looks at Zchiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. On the one hand, we know we're supposed to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim every single day. But then there's the mitzvah of Zchiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, telling the story in the night of Pesach. And again, we know that they're very, very different. When do we do the mitzvah in the most complete way? We have to elaborate on it. And many other halachas is going to be on the night of Pesach. Every single day of the year, we're also remembering it, but it's not going to be with the same shleimus and the same perfect way as it is on the night of Pesach. The rest of the year is more like a result. Because we have it on Pesach, we also have it in a little miniature way the rest of the year as well. And the Rebbe finally gives one more example for this idea. And the Rebbe says like this: we have a Mishnah which speaks about the various different memunim, people appointed on different things in the Beis HaMikdash, different jobs. And the Mishnah enumerates names of the people that were in charge. Now, the question is, these people were in charge, this is only one set of people. Clearly, over many, many generations, you had different people being in charge. So why are these names being mentioned? The Rav says something very, very interesting. The Bartanura says that there were the original people that had these names that the Mishnah mentions, that had these jobs, and then in all future generations, all the other people that were appointed over the same job were called by this original name that whoever had that job originally was called. And the question is, what would be the point of that? Why would that be? Why is this job connected to this name that even if it's not my personal name, I'll be called by that name? So the Rebbe says we know that a name expresses the characteristics of the person who has the name. The Gemara says that a mayor would be medayik, would learn things from a person's name about the person. In our case, says the Rebbe, why were particular people chosen for a particular task of the Beis HaMikdash? It's clearly because they had the characteristics that were suitable for this particular job, and it would have been expressed in their name as well, because their character will be expressed in their name. In future generations, again, people were of course looked for that had these characteristics, but not necessarily they had the same name. Because the original people that had the name, they had this characteristic in its fullest way, that it even expressed itself in the name. When they found people in later generations suitable for this job, they had it, but it wasn't with the same perfect shleimus. The Rebbe now brings all of this back to the idea of Shemitah. We have the idea of the 7th year for Klal Yisrael. Obviously, that's the most perfect idea of Shemitah, and that brings along with it all the halachas of the rest of the land, of all the dinim of Shemitah, etc. But there's also the 7th year of the individual. The slave was sold, and now it's his 7th year. And because they're both 7, there's a certain common denominator. And therefore, he has also his personal rest that he gets, and his freedom that he gets on the 7th year. The Zohar is telling us, when the land rests, this is the slave is also supposed to be resting. In other words, what we're saying is that this slave is supposed to have his rest on his 7th year because he's part of Klal Yisrael, who generally has a rest on their 7th year. So he also gets a rest on his 7th year, and he goes free. But the Rebbe says, imagine now if his 7th year will also coincide with the Shnas HaShemitah in the literal sense, then that freedom will be in a more perfect way, as per all the examples that we gave before. For example, we said about Sfiras Oimer, it has the 7 complete weeks, but when it comes out that we count it also Mimocharas HaShabbos in the literal sense, and the Sfiras in a more perfect way. And this is what the Zohar means when it says, and just says plain, that when the land is resting, the slave should also get his rest, which sounds like it was saying that the Zohar is saying in the literal sense that the Eved goes out free on Shemitah, because what the Zohar is saying is that in this particular case, if it is Shemitah, then the slave's freedom will be in its most perfect way, together with the Shemitah of Klal Yisrael.